It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week, the government fails to fly any illegal migrants to Rwanda, but says it's still the right policy.
We believe that we are fully compliant with our domestic and international obligations, and preparations for our future flights and the next flights have already begun.
It's not serious policy, it's shameless posturing, and she knows it. It's not building consensus, it's just pursuing division. It is government by gimmick.
Prime Minister's questions turns into a clash of lightsabers.
He thinks he's Obi-Wan Kenobi. The truth is he's Jabba the Hutt.
We're helping people with the cost of living with £1,200. On the 14th of July, the money will be going into people's bank accounts.
Concerns in the House and beyond about whether we'll be able to get abroad on holiday this summer.
The airlines and the government were encouraging people to travel again, and we think they just underestimated the capacity issues and the shortages both within the airlines and the airport services.
And Brexit rears its head again in the Welsh Senedd.
Isn't there a very simple practical solution, which is rejoining now the single market and the customs union?
Let's start with the story that has dominated parliamentary discussion this week, and that's that flight to Rwanda that didn't in the end actually take off, Sean. Precisely no one was sent to Rwanda as part of the government's new asylum policy, and calm weather in the English Channel meant that many, many more arrived on our shores. Where does that leave the government and their policy?
The government is standing by the policy. It's this government's solution to a problem that many ministers have faced over the years. This is the issue of people who get to northern France and then come to the UK, either on the small boats crossing the Channel or sometimes hiding in the back of lorries. So the government has been very determined that it would act against this. It has said that people who come to this country illegally will be liable to be sent to Rwanda, a one-way ticket to Rwanda. So they'll get the opportunity to claim asylum there, but not here in the UK. So we had a day of legal wrangling when this plane was waiting to take off, and we weren't sure how many people would be on it. And then there was a last-minute intervention by the European Court of Human Rights. And to no one's great surprise, the next day we heard from the Home Secretary.
We remain committed to this policy. These repeated legal barriers are, Madam Deputy Speaker, very similar to those that we experience with all other removal flights, and we believe that we are fully compliant with our domestic and international obligations, and preparations for our future flights and the next flights have already begun. We cannot keep on spending nearly £5 million a day on accommodation, including that of hotels. We cannot accept this intolerable pressure on public services and local communities. This government will not be deterred from doing the right thing. We will not be put off by the inevitable legal last-minute challenges, nor we will allow mobs, Madam Deputy Speaker, to block removals. We will not stand idly by and let organised crime gangs, who are despicable in their nature and their conduct, evil people, treat human beings as cargo.
This is not and never has been a serious policy, and she knew that when she chartered the plane. She knew that among the people she was planning to send to Rwanda on this plane were torture and trafficking victims. This isn't a long-term plan, it is a short-term stunt. Everyone can see it. It's not serious policy, it's shameless posturing, and she knows it. It's not building consensus, it's just pursuing division. It is government by gimmick.
My party continues to deplore this unworkable, illegal and immoral policy, and it does nothing to stop smugglers and it inflicts serious harm on victims despite the Home Secretary's cloud cuckoo land description of it.
Last November, I stood on Dover's seafront and I mourned 27 people who were drowned in the English Channel. Of those people who'd been travelling in these small boats, these unseaworthy vessels, 7 were women, 1 was a teenager, and 1 was a 7-year-old child. In addition, up to 166 people are feared to have lost their lives or are missing across the Channel. People who were safe already. They were safe in France. Overnight, many of my constituents have got in touch with me. They are anguished at developments that have occurred to stop effective action to tackle the crossings.
Yesterday, 444 people made the dangerous crossing in small boats, which suggests that the deterrent effect of this policy is not getting through. That's the highest number in 2 months since 681 crossed the day after she announced this policy.
So that was very much a heated debate about a policy of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. There was some more unexpected drama this week too, Sean, when the government's ethics advisor, Lord Geit, suddenly resigned. Why?
Yes, this is the person who's there to advise the Prime Minister on how the ministerial code, the rule book for senior members of the government, works. He had a fairly lengthy appearance before a select committee earlier in the week when he was questioned about his role in the annual report, and then on Wednesday night took everybody by surprise when he resigned. On Thursday we got this exchange of letters between Lord Geit and the Prime Minister. A lot of people wondered if he'd been tempted to resign over Partygate. He says in this letter he came close to resigning over Partygate, but that wasn't it. And instead, he said that he'd been put in a very difficult position. It's an odious position because he'd been asked to make a judgment about a particular policy in the ministerial code, and this then prompted him to go. And now it transpires from the Prime Minister's reply that he was being asked to give guidance on a trade issue. Now, this, I think, is a story that will have some way to go yet. And I wouldn't be at all surprised that when Parliament comes back on Monday, there are more questions about why Lord Geit left his post.
Yes, because you can definitely tell that Number 10 and ministers were slightly surprised by the timing of his resignation after he had been questioned by MPs. And then I suppose they have to find a replacement.
They do. And the last time, I mean, we shouldn't forget, this is the second advisor that Boris Johnson has had since he's been in Number 10. The first one, Sir Alex Allen, a former very senior civil servant, resigned. And then there was a 5-month gap before Lord Geit was appointed. So it could be some time before we find out who his replacement is.
Let's talk briefly about the economy, because this week saw a fall in GDP for the second month in a row, and fears of a trade war with Europe over the Northern Ireland Protocol, those trading arrangements post-Brexit for Northern Ireland. Were there jitters in the House?
Well, those figures that were published about GDP, those were the figures for April. So they showed that the economy had shrunk during April. And why is that significant? Well, it's significant any month the economy shrinks, but it was the second month in a row, and that prompts fears about, well, what's the longer term picture for the economy like? And so there was an urgent question. Labour forced a minister to come to the dispatch box to answer their questions about the direction that the economy is going in.
The fall in GDP on the month is driven by the impact of the wind down of the NHS COVID testing programme. Testing volumes fell 70% from March to April, which alongside the impact from vaccines detracted 0.5 percentage points from GDP growth in April. Looking through the impact of falling tests, the rest of the economy actually grew by 0.1%. Importantly, GDP is still 0.9% above pre-pandemic levels, and support provided over the past 2 years has put the UK economy in a good position to deal with any economic headwinds, with record numbers of employees on payrolls and a strong economic recovery from the pandemic. As the Chancellor has also said, that while the next few months will be tough, where we can act, we will.
The government benches had a chance to change direction last week. They had a chance to install new leadership that might have given us some hope of a greater sense of grip on all this. But what did they do? They decided that the best person to turn the economy round, to sort out the chaos and the backlogs, and bring the qualities of focus, attention to detail and sustained delivery to these matters was the current Prime Minister.
Figures published recently by the HMRC show that the number of UK businesses exporting goods to the European Union fell by an astonishing 33% between 2020 and 2021. Does the government recognise that the cost, bureaucracy and paperwork that it has imposed on businesses, particularly small ones, is the principal cause of that loss of export opportunities for British firms?
Minister.
No, I don't. I accept that was a very challenging period, obviously, for economies everywhere. There's a period of adjustment, and the government will be working in a coordinated fashion to remove any frictions that exist and to ease the passage of trade, particularly for smaller businesses.
The Minister's already conceded that the Treasury wants us to reduce friction with our European trading partners. That's the right thing to do. Can you tell the House then, is it the Treasury policy to agree that this is the right time to rip up the Northern Ireland Protocol and risk a trade war with Europe?
Well, clearly, in different markets, there will be different challenges. And what we must do is ensure that we have a deep dialogue, that we look to find a consensus, and where we can't, we have to take action.
It doesn't shock me that the Labour Party use any opportunity they have to come in here and bash Britain and sneer at places like Stoke-on-Trent. But it's thanks to this Conservative government and a Conservative-led council that's created thousands of new jobs through the successful Ceramics Valley Enterprise Zone, whether it be the 500 new Home Office jobs or up to 1,700 new jobs thanks to the Kidsgrove Town deal. Does the Minister agree with me that it's this government that's putting places like Stoke-on-Trent firmly on the map?
Yeah. Well, I don't think Stoke-on-Trent could have a better advocate in the Honourable Gentleman. That passionate desire to highlight the successes that are going on in his constituency, and I absolutely agree with him that it's that positivity, focusing on interventions that are making a real difference to people who live in his community, is what people will remember as we move forward.
Treasury Minister John Glenn answering questions there about the economy. We'll be back with Sean shortly. Let's go to Edinburgh and to Holyrood and talk to our reporter there, Jenny Davidson. Hello to you. Jenny, the First Minister launched a new campaign for independence this week, but the presiding officer wasn't happy about the way it was announced, was she?
That's right, Joe. Yes, the First Minister gave some interviews on Monday afternoon ahead of a press conference on Tuesday morning where she launched a new campaign for independence and the first in a series of papers making the case for independence. But the Scottish Parliament's presiding officer, Alison Johnson, made clear she was very unhappy that such a major announcement had been made in the media before it was made to Parliament. It's something she's warned the Scottish Government about before, but this time she actually barred Constitution Secretary Angus Robertson from making his statement to Parliament, and she moved straight to questions.
Yesterday afternoon, significant news that should have been announced in this chamber as a matter of courtesy and respect to the Parliament was reported by national media, trailing a media event this morning. Long-established good practice guidance on announcements by the Scottish Government states that announcements by government on matters of importance should not enter the public domain before or without being communicated to the Parliament. Where the subject matter relates to matters on which members of the public would have a clear interest, there is a strong expectation that the ministerial statement would be scheduled with appropriate notice, and where that ministerial statement has been programmed, the details of the statement should not be released to the media before the statement is made. Now, it is not possible to square the government's actions on this matter with respect for this guidance, which is designed to ensure that this Parliament is given its proper place. It is my role to represent this Parliament's interest, and in doing so I take account of all members' interests equally. The Government is in no doubt that I do not regard this as acceptable. And in these circumstances, the Parliament's time is used best by moving straight to questions, and I call Douglas Ross.
As I said, the first in a series of papers was published this week on plans for independence. There's going to be further papers published on big issues like currency, pensions, security, trade. And so the Scottish Government's obviously going to have to tread carefully in terms of how it goes about those announcements in future.
Yes, clearly. Jenny, what did the opposition parties have to say about the timing of this new push for independence?
Well, they were really questioning why the Scottish Government is pushing for another independence referendum at this time when the country is facing so many big issues, big challenges that the Scottish Government could be dealing with. And it's asking, well, if the purpose of independence is to make Scotland a better country, why not just use the powers of the Scottish Parliament, the powers the Parliament already has, to deal with some of these issues and make Scotland a better country now? But Constitution Secretary Angus Robertson was making the point that it's a matter of democracy. He said that a majority of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament had been elected at last year's election on a mandate to hold such a referendum during the course of this parliamentary term.
Nicola Sturgeon pushes her obsession with separation by asking, why not Scotland? So let me ask a better question. Why not improve Scotland now? Why not use the powers of this Parliament that you have right now to improve the lives of the people of Scotland? Why not create better Scottish jobs now? Why not restore Scottish schools now? Why not tackle Scotland's drug death shame now?
When the report says that an independent Scotland could not be transformed to match the success of the comparator countries overnight, given that we've been told it would be Brexit times 10, will the Cabinet Secretary admit it would make Brexit look like a walk in the park?
The First Minister described Scotland as a nation in waiting. Presiding Officer, we are exactly that. We are a nation in waiting. We're waiting for ambulances and cancer care, long COVID clinics and mental health appointments for our children. We're waiting for overdue ferries and replacement bus services for cancelled trains, for progress on pupil attainment and the climate emergency. We're waiting for help with the biggest hit to household incomes since the end of rationing. Presiding Officer, we are tired of waiting. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary why every single one of these priorities has now fallen behind the breakup of the United Kingdom in the queue for this government's attention?
Now we have all of the opposition parties lining up in their agreement of democracy denial. It is a sad day that illiberal, anti-democrats stand up and suggest that we should not go forward with a democratic vote about the future of the country. It's frankly shameful. We will be on different sides of the argument about Scotland's future, but please don't come here to the chamber and say the people of Scotland can't have their say when they voted in an election that they should be able to do just that.
It's clearly been the issue of the week, Jenny, so no doubt it cropped up in First Minister's questions as well.
That's right, and while the focus of the initial debate was on whether there should actually be a referendum in independence, Nicola Sturgeon was talking more about the case for independence itself. She said that far from being distinct or separate from the challenges that Scotland is facing right now, that actually that's part of the solution to these challenges. And that was the point that was being made in the paper that was published earlier this week. It was comparing Scotland and the UK with a number of small European countries on things like the economy and productivity and on poverty, and suggesting that Scotland would do better if it was also a small European country, something not everyone obviously agrees with.
The SNP government have said they want to hold another divisive independence referendum in October next year. But Nicola Sturgeon can't even say if ferries will float by then. She won't have closed the school attainment gap by then. She won't have returned NHS services to normal by then. And she won't have cleared the court backlogs by then. So, First Minister, why should all these pressing issues play second fiddle to another divisive independence referendum next year?
First Minister. It's not the distraction that Douglas Ross wants to pretend it is. Instead, it presents an alternative to a failing UK system. A failing UK system that gives us, right now, a Prime Minister with no democratic or moral mandate in Scotland, that has given us a Brexit we did not vote for, that is giving us the highest inflation in the G7, the lowest projected growth in the G20, with the sole exception of Russia, that is constraining our public finances and tying the hands of this government. And of course, a UK system that gives us the obscenity of a government that tries to shore up its own base by deporting vulnerable people to Rwanda. Utterly immoral. So independence is an alternative to that, and it gives this Parliament additional powers to navigate those challenges and to meet the full, massive potential of this country.
And one of the other key issues is actually the process for holding a referendum, and Nicola Sturgeon has said she's going to make a statement to Parliament about that before the summer recess. We can expect that within the next couple of weeks.
Thanks very much, Jenny. That's Jenny Davison, our reporter there at Holyrood in Edinburgh. Sean Curran is still with me. Sean, lots of us, especially us, look forward to Prime Minister's questions each week for a bit of cut and thrust and parliamentary jousting and perhaps a bit more theatre this week. What were the high points?
Well, it was panto this week, I think. It was a ferociously rowdy session of Prime Minister's questions. You don't always get that when you're watching the TV clips, because the microphones in the House of Commons chamber are there really for our benefit so that we can hear what is being said clearly. They don't help the MPs who are there. I was in the chamber for this week's session of Prime Minister's questions, as I often am, and I can tell you that by the end it was impossible to hear what anybody said because there was so much heckling, so much jeering from both sides. I mean, what was interesting was that it was like that right from the very first minute. As soon as things got underway, there was a lot of shouting, a lot of jeering, lots of finger wagging. Now, of course, both Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer arrived at Prime Minister's questions with something to prove. We're still only just over a week on from that vote of confidence for Boris Johnson, and there'd been some disobliging reports that perhaps some members of the Labour Party thought Sir Keir Starmer was, well, a bit boring. So he was setting out quite clearly, I think, to be as interesting and as exciting as he possibly could be.
Britain is set for lower growth than every major economy except Russia. Why?
Actually, we are going to have, according to the IMF and the OECD, we are, in addition to the fastest growth in the G7 last year, we're going to have the second fastest this year, and we will return to the top of the table, Mr. Speaker. But the reason, Mr. Speaker, other countries are temporarily moving ahead is, of course, because we came out of the pandemic faster than they did.
Britain isn't under crippling economic sanctions like Russia. No wonder he doesn't want to answer the question, why is the UK set for lower growth than every other major economy?
Prime Minister! Mr. Speaker, I think everybody can see that I've just answered the question. What would be useful in supporting the UK economy right now would be if the leader of the Labour Party ended his sphinx-like silence about the RMT strikes coming up in the course of the next couple of weeks.
He wants the country to grind to a halt so he can feed off the division. And as for Mr. Speaker, as for his boasting about the economy, he thinks he can perform Jedi mind tricks on the country. These aren't the droids you're looking for. No rules were broken. The economy is booming. The problem is, the Force just isn't with him anymore. He thinks he's Obi-Wan Kenobi. The truth is, he's Jabba the Hutt.
We're helping people with the cost of living with £1,200. On the 14th of July, the money will be going into people's bank accounts. Why can we do that, Mr. Speaker? Because we have the fiscal firepower to do it, because the economy is in robust shape.
I've got a long list here of what his MPs really think of him. Dragging everyone down. Who said that? Come on. Who was it said that? Authority is destroyed. Come on, hands up. Which of you was it? Which of you? Come on. Can't win back trust. Anybody owning up? You're very quiet now. Hands. My personal favourite is this. This is a document circulated by his backbench, in which they call him the Conservative Corbyn. Prime Minister, I don't think that was intended as a compliment.
A couple of quick points about Mr Corbyn, the Right Honourable Member for Islington North. First of all, he tried repeatedly to get him elected as Prime Minister. Secondly, speaking from experience, he's relatively dynamic by comparison with the Right Honourable Gentleman.
So that was PMQ, Sean. But the rising price of food has also featured in Parliament this week. What was the focus of the discussion?
Food and the cost of people's grocery bills is a big concern. The government's very keen also to show that it's getting to grips with these big issues. This week, it launched its food strategy for England. Now, this came out of a report that had been commissioned by the government. It was delivered by the restaurant owner, Henry Dimbleby. He made a range of suggestions, half of which, he says, weren't taken up. Now, a lot of this concerns things like the supply chain and making sure that there's enough food homegrown. And of course, it also touches upon issues that affect the whole of the UK. And the Minister came to the Commons to make a statement.
With the cost of agricultural commodities linked to global gas prices, we recognise concerns about the cost of food. And through this strategy, we are setting out long-term measures to support a food system that offers access to healthy and sustainable food for all. It will complement the measures we've already taken to support those struggling to afford food and help them eat healthily through the Healthy Start scheme, breakfast clubs and the holiday activities and food programme. Our fresh produce industry has always required access to seasonal labour, and I'm pleased to announce today that we will bring forward another 10,000 visas for the seasonal workers route and expand the scheme to cover poultry.
What we should have been discussing today is a real plan for delivery, a plan to put right the government's record of failure. And let's outline exactly where the government are up to. For households, 7.3 million people living in food poverty. 2.6 million of those are children. 2.1 million food parcels handed out last year alone. 64% of all adults are obese and 40% of children are too.
Agri-food is an absolutely hugely significant industry, providing a great deal of employment, and it's of huge strategic importance to us as a country. It's therefore really quite troubling, and I hope that the Secretary of State would share how troubled I am with this, when to hear the NFU President, Minette Batters, say earlier today that this is an industry that's in absolute crisis. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's really easy to see why. We have massive labour shortages, we've got food going unpicked, we've got food being ploughed back into fields, and while I welcome the 40,000 visas that have been announced, which, with the 10,000 additional that have been announced, I have to say to the Secretary of State that barely scratches the surface of demand across Scotland, let alone the rest of the UK, to tackle those issues.
Our children's health and education should be a top priority. Yet not only have ministers rejected Henry Dimbleby's recommendation to give a free school lunch to every child whose parents are in universal credit, they've even rejected his backup, less generous proposal to change the eligibility criteria. So will the Secretary of State listen to parents and think again about denying an extra 1.5 million children in struggling households a free school meal?
Secretary of State. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the principal driver of pressure on household budgets at the moment is that very sharp rise in energy costs. And the measures that the Chancellor announced 2 weeks ago are a major step towards helping the poorest households in this country deal with that blow to their finances.
Thank you very much, Sean. We'll be back with you shortly. Time to go to Cardiff, where our correspondent James Williams can tell us what's been happening in the Senedd this week. Hello to you, James. Tuesday marked the 5th anniversary of the Grenfell tragedy, and there were questions to the First Minister about fire safety work in Wales. Tell us about them.
Yeah, exactly, Joe. Tributes, as you'd expect, were paid here in the Senedd, and we expect a statement from the Welsh Government at the end of the month in which they'll outline the work that they've been doing in this area. But nevertheless, the Leader of the Opposition asked the First Minister on Tuesday for an update on Welsh Government progress.
I would hope that at the earliest opportunity, therefore, the Government will bring this statement forward so that
those who are tied up in this horrible, horrible vortex that they find themselves in, where they feel helpless, and yet bills are landing on their doormats for leasehold demands, and yet they go to bed at night living in what could potentially be a fire keg because the cladding on their properties has not been replaced, is still in existence here in Wales, across many parts of Wales, in fact. The Minister announced £375 million at the end of March. Are you in a position to confirm how much of that money has been allocated already?
We want the money to leave the Welsh Government and to be doing the good that it's intended to do as fast as possible. It's for spending over 3 years. Can I make just one specific point to the Leader of the Opposition? This money is not just for cladding. And this is a big difference between the approach we are taking in Wales and the approach being taken elsewhere. Cladding is only one of the building defects that causes a risk of fire in those blocks.
So, as the First Minister touched on there, because the Welsh Government is looking to rectify a wider range of issues than just cladding, it's taking longer here in Wales to remediate some of the problems with private flats. And so they're looking, for example, to still conduct intrusive surveys on around about 100 buildings. So you've got leaseholders here in Wales, some of whom were gathered outside the Senedd on Tuesday for a vigil, who are increasingly desperate, exasperated that 5 years on from Grenfell, little, if any, safety work has actually been carried out on private flats.
Yes, will be interesting to get a further update on what's going on with all of that. And Brexit was also back on the agenda, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Now, Plaid Cymru were very strong advocates of a second EU referendum during the long drawn-out Brexit negotiations. But once Boris Johnson won his majority, the party shifted its position and decided that the debate was over and the thing to do now was to advocate for a better form of Brexit, what have you. But on Tuesday, for the first time in quite some time, we heard the party making the case once again for Wales and the UK to rejoin the single market and the customs union. Here's the party's leader, Adam Price.
Given that cost of living crisis and the challenges we're facing in every sector of the economy, as the First Minister said, in every part of the UK bar London, isn't there a very simple practical solution that you've just alluded to, which is returning to the principle at the heart of securing Wales' future, the white paper we jointly published between us, which is rejoining now the single market and the customs union, as even some Tory MPs have been arguing in the last couple of days. Indeed, even the former MEP, Baron Daniel Hannan, Baron Brexit, has been arguing we should never have left the single market now. Will you make that, is that still the policy of the Welsh Government, and will you make that case for single market membership, not just to Boris Johnson, but I also should add to the Leader of the Opposition, who's been a little bit vague on this question today? Yeah.
And yet the First Minister didn't quite answer Adam Price's question. He made the pretty obvious factual assertion that if we were members of the EU single market, then there would be fewer barriers to trade with the European Union. He came short from actually advocating that we should rejoin the single market, which is very much in line, of course, with what the Labour Party in Westminster is advocating, no longer saying that we should be members of the EU single market and customs union. But we had a Welsh Labour MP, frontbencher Anna McMorrin, reprimanded by the party earlier this week because a leaked recording of a private meeting was published by The Sun in which she was heard saying that, well, if Labour was back in power, then she'd hoped that we would rejoin the single market and maybe even the customs union.
Yes, indeed, she did, James, or reportedly so. It was health questions in the Senedd on Wednesday, with the Welsh NHS under huge pressure. What was covered?
Yeah, so lots of focus on the lack of NHS dentists, lots of focus also on the pressures on social care and how that's actually feeding into the pressures on hospitals right across the board, from A&E and ambulances. Plaid Cymru making the point in the chamber, well, isn't there an issue with the fact that we've seen so many hospital beds lost here in Wales over the years as well? So from just over 15,000 30 years ago to around about 10,000 today. This is what the Health Minister had to say in response.
With regard to the number of beds in Wales, of course, what we have to remember is that ideally what we want to see is patients going in, being treated and then returning home. We want to see more care in the home for patients, and certainly that's where my focus is, to try to get people discharged from hospital as soon as possible. And what that means, possible to be told, is that you want fewer beds because that you want them to be discharged and at home. And what we want to do is to strengthen the care in those communities, as you say, and that's what I want to see. It's interesting that the Nuffield Trust, for example, last week had stated in its report
270 beds per 100,000 in Wales compared to 170 beds per 100,000 in England. So if you compare our figures in terms of beds here in Wales compared to England, then we come out much better than they do.
And just to finish, we should say that the Health Minister, Lynn Morgan, will be back here in the Senedd on Wednesday for a very different reason. She's due to be reprimanded by the Senedd after she was banned from driving for 6 months for speeding. The First Minister has dealt with the issue under the Ministerial Code. He is not going to discipline her any further, and as far as he's concerned, the matter is closed.
Oh dear. James Williams at the Senedd, thank you very much. Let's return to Sean here at Westminster. Sean, there's been concern about freedom of speech coming under pressure at universities. Who raised this?
This has been a big issue for some time. The reason MPs were talking about it this week is because they were just finishing off looking at the details in the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill. One of the concerns has been the influence of some foreign countries, and we know that some Conservative MPs were particularly concerned. So the government had come up with its own changes. It was going to change its own legislation, and it's basically going to tighten up the rules so that universities and student organisations have got more of a responsibility to protect and promote freedom of speech, and there will be some penalties if they don't follow the rules.
A King's College London survey in 2019 found that, chillingly, 1 in 4 students believe physical violence is justified to shut down views that they deem to be hateful. A report the following year by Policy Exchange found widespread self-censorship amongst university staff. But students and staff didn't need to wait for these damning studies or hear oral evidence to be published to know that there is a problem. The students forced to self-censor know there is a problem. The academics bullied off campus, excluded by colleagues or forced to censor their lectures know there is a problem. This government not only understands there is a problem, we have a plan to solve it. By requiring providers not only to protect but also promote free speech and academic freedom, and placing freedom of speech duties directly on student unions. By introducing effective enforcement mechanisms through the Office for Students, because we all know that a law where no enforcement mechanisms is there is toothless. The new Director for Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom on the OFS board will be able to force improvements, impose penalties, including fines, if these new duties are breached.
Having an Orwellian Director of Freedom of Speech sounds a contradiction in terms, but the appointee will certainly have sweeping powers. They alone will be responsible for making sure universities and student unions are upholding their freedom of speech duties, acting as judge, jury and executioner in free speech complaints, and potentially monitoring overseas funding of universities and student unions. As job descriptions go, it is unprecedented. The Minister herself acknowledged on Radio 4 that this bill emboldens Holocaust deniers and other purveyors of hate speech by giving them the powers to make vexatious complaints against universities. Invariably, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are competing interests at stake when speakers are invited onto our campuses. Freedom of speech is not a trump card. Students also have a right not to be harassed, not to be subjected to hate speech, and perhaps most importantly, a right to protest.
Important story there, Sean. Something else that many people will be interested in is whether we'll get away successfully on our summer holidays this year. What's been happening?
This week, the government and the Civil Aviation Authority wrote to the airlines telling them, basically, if you're going to cancel flights, we want to start telling people now. And that's because they do not want to see a repeat of the last-minute cancellations that caused problems for so many families over half-term, and there was chaos at some airports because of delays and cancelled flights. Now, that announcement from the government and the Civil Aviation Authority came after a day when the Business Committee, a cross-party group of MPs, had been questioning senior figures from the aviation and holiday industry and also hearing from consumer groups as well. And they were obviously starting from the point of view of, well, what happened just a few weeks ago and who was to blame?
What on earth is going on? Why have we got this problem right now when we've not had it before?
Well, we think that both the industry and the government need to shoulder the responsibility for the chaos that we've seen. The airlines and the government were encouraging people to travel again, and we think they've just underestimated the capacity issues and the shortages both within the airlines and the airport services, including baggage handlers, for example. But what concerns this is that we're still seeing airlines appearing to book flights when they don't know for sure that those flights are actually going to be able to go.
Shortages have been a problem. If an airport is open, you have to have your air traffic controllers, you have to have the runway maintenance, and so those people were maintained. That's why we had such large losses in airports, because we did stay open and we maintained those. But certainly other parts that are more reliant and more dependent on passenger services, like security, for example, within the airport, when you don't have passengers, there isn't a role for those people. So furlough helped, but lots of people didn't stay. We couldn't keep them on, as you would appreciate in our industry, which is safety and security is our top priority. There's increased vetting for those sort of staff. So shortages have played a particular role, certainly in the kinds of queues at security that you saw earlier on, hopefully beginning to improve.
Thank you. Oliver Richardson, is it as simple as to say we sacked a load of people during the pandemic and now we can't hire them back quick enough?
In one sense, yes. In another sense, it's more complex. So, for example, Ryanair were very clear. We negotiated an agreement with them. The basis of the agreement were no redundancies. So they're in a different position from the likes of BA, who went through the fire and rehire, where not only did they lose 10,000 staff through redundancy, they also radically changed the terms and conditions. So they did get rid of too many people in a number of instances. The terms and conditions for those remaining were lessened, and then when it comes to attracting people to the industry, it simply isn't as attractive as it was.
British Airways has by far had the most cancellations per day of any airline at the moment. You sacked 10,000 workers aggressively using the fire and rehire tactic. Isn't it your own fault?
You know, British Airways was basically losing £20 million a day. The schedule around that time was 5% of 2019 levels. There wasn't a vaccine in sight, and there wasn't certainty over the furlough programme being extended. And actually, the furlough scheme itself only covered 10% of the 2019 employee bill that we had to pay. So look, the airline itself was in a very precarious situation.
If I could move on to EasyJet, please, Sophie Deckers. I understand that you also made about 5,000 staff redundant, and in the league table given to us by Simon Calder this morning, EasyJet was the second worst airline, with around 55 flights being cancelled per day. Do you think there was a connection between the number of staff you sacked and your ability to fly planes today?
It's taking around 14 weeks now to get crew ID passes. It was around 10 weeks pre-pandemic in a normal year. The complexity is you need the last 5 years worth of referencing. And as we know, lots of people, we again touched on this morning, have taken other roles, but multiple roles. And it's up to the way that we have to work at the moment is through the individual who we're recruiting. We have to get them to get all of those references. And in many cases, people have had 10 jobs in the last couple of years.
Thanks to Sean and all our guests this week. That's all we have time for on Politics UK. I'll be back on BBC Two at 12:15 on Monday with more Politics Live. Until then, have a great weekend.